Yeah, I'm kind of recovering from a little bit of a cold, a little tough to talk, which is unfortunate because Betsy's winning all the arguments at home. But anyway, our speaker today is Dr. Brandon Scott, one of our favorites, and we're certainly glad he's brave enough to come back and talk to the class. He's going to speak today on ethical decisions and the evolution of ethical decisions, I guess, throughout the ages. So, Brandon, come on up.
I normally talk about New Testament topics, and this will have nothing about New Testament in it, so I am out of my field. But I have long been interested in ethics because I ultimately think that's what life comes down to, is making ethical decisions. Or as Plato said, how do you live the good life? I mean, I think that's really the ultimate question we all face, and how you go about making them is important to try to think about. So I start everything historical. I'm a historian. It's the way I think. You ask me any question and I'll give you its history. That's just, the people in this room, we're all roughly the same age. This is where we got started in the 60s, okay? And I'm going to tell you right off the bat, we lived through one of the most revolutionary periods in human history. Absolutely one of the most chaotic and revolutionary periods that humans have ever experienced. And by the way, it's still going on. It has not reached a resolution at this point. And so just to remind you of your life, you had civil rights, which got kicked off in the 60s. The March on Washington, the largest march that ever took place in Washington, D.C. King and his group. Rock and roll. I put rock and roll right up there in top. For me, it would not be Elvis Presley, but Chuck Berry. The real stuff, as far as I'm concerned. But rock and roll was fundamentally revolutionary because its primary audience was not male, but female. And that's what was so upsetting to many people, is that women were dancing freely, like they were getting ready to engage in sex, and that scared the hell out of everybody. We had the anti-war protest. These were huge. They brought a government down. You know, LBJ did not run. That is the equivalent of a coup. Okay, it brought the government down. I happen to have been on both sides. I was both in Vietnam and in the protests. So I covered. I always loved this picture. And then we had the feminist revolution, which got started in this period. And it is connected to all these things. It's not just one thing. It is, in many ways, the linchpin that holds all of them together. It has been that way almost from the beginning, that women's liberation and anti-slavery movements are tied because they're the same thing. They're exactly the same thing. And we had a sexual revolution. Okay, this was the one I missed. But at any rate, these are, if you think about it, this is your life in many ways, right? And all these things got turned upside down in fundamental ways that had been in place for millennium, not just a couple years, millennium, since we came out of the caves, basically. Okay? And finally, the last one in the group is LBT, the gay revolution, which is the final group to come out of the closet, have been the gays. And I find this is the headlines from the New York Times last week. It's just absolutely astounding that apparently the Congress will pass, with bipartisan support, protection for LGBT rights. That's amazing. The Mormon Church came out in favor of the bill. But so did your church too, by the way. But there are a lot more Mormons than are of you. The Catholic Church, of course, did not come out in favor of it. It vehemently opposed it. Although every Catholic Democratic senator voted for it. Very interesting what's going on. So this is an amazing thing. This is a really kind of a revolution in many ways. These are just some statistics. Don't look too seriously at this. But this is marriage rates per 1,000 starting in 1900 and down to today. You had this big spike after World War II. But basically, it's on a downcline, folks. Just people are not getting married. And this is the recent one. In 2019, only 53% of the population over 25 was married. That's a historic low. And we will soon go the other way. Those of us who are married will be, for the first time, in the minority. It's going to happen. It's just, and we're behind Europe. You know, Scandinavian countries, only 19% of the people get married. So that's your future. Well, not mine, I'll be dead, but but I mean, you know, the trends are happening. And it's worth noting. I love this poem. Philip Larkin is one of my favorite poets. Sexual intercourse began in 1963, which was rather late for me, and between the end of Chatterley's band and the Beatles' first LP. And that's, he's really right. It suddenly got made into the public, you know, that it was on the screen. You know, all of that happened in a very narrow period of time. And it's really quite revolutionary. Okay. Traditional ethics consist of two parts. And by traditional, I mean really traditional. Everything from, this really includes ethics from the time we started thinking about ethics all the way up into the current day. So it has two parts, law and duty. For law, it must be given by a competent lawgiver. You can't just make up any kind of law wherever you want to. There has to be a competent lawgiver, namely a god or a king, some authority figure. Okay? It must be reasonable. This is really important. From Plato all the way through Thomas Aquinas, who is really one of the most important thinkers on this issue. He really summarizes. Aquinas, in the third volume of the Summa, summarizes basically the movement from Plato to Aristotle to Augustine to himself and creates what becomes the modern ethical system. It must be reasonable. Aquinas is bright, and so is Aristotle. They don't argue about what's justice. They just say it has to be reasonable. Unreasonable laws are not binding. They have to be reasonable. You can't require people to do unreasonable things. See? It sounds stupid, but it's actually a fairly important part to get right. If you keep asking what's just, you're not going to get anywhere. That's a very hard question to solve. Okay? But what's reasonable is much more easier to solve. It also has an important corollary. You can't require people to do heroic things. Heroism has to do with virtue. Okay? Law has to do with what's reasonable. That's a fundamental difference. And finally, it must be for the common good. In many ways, Plato, Aristotle, and Aquinas are what we today would call utilitarians. Okay? It's the common good. It's not what you think is right. It's what fits the whole group. So you might be disadvantaged in order that the whole may prosper. If you ask me as a historian, this is what we today in this country no longer have any sense of. And I don't care whether you're Republican or Democrat, we have no sense of the common good. We have lost it. And it's a fundamental problem. Okay? These old guys knew what they were talking about in many ways. I mean, they really did, okay? The second part of ethical decision making in the ancient world and up to the modern time was duty. You had the law, which is given by the lawgiver, and our response to that is our duty is to obey it. So everything is put about in duty. Okay? And there's a technical word for this. It's called deontology, from the Greek word deon, which means duty. Isn't that brilliant? Okay. But technically, the whole traditional system is a deontological system. It's based upon duty. Your responsibility, my responsibility, is to follow the law, not to question it. That's the lawgiver's responsibility. Okay. How many times have you heard, I'm going to tell your father? That's duty. You don't argue about whether it's right or wrong. You're just supposed to do it, right? That's deontology. Okay. Traditional ethics are based on the chain of being. They are fundamentally hierarchical and patriarchal. Hierarchy and patriarchy are the same thing. It's just patriarchy actually says what it is. Hierarchy is kind of hiding what it actually is. Okay? So it's fundamentally hierarchical. Why? Because it comes down. You're on the bottom, and your duty is to follow the gods or the king or the emperor or whatever it is that's on top, or dad. They make the rules. Okay? So this is a kind of a traditional view of this. You can see that's actually Yahweh in his heaven. But here's a more modern version of it so you can actually read it. and you just stretch this out. In Plato and Aristotle's vision of this, by the way, it's important to understand. It's called a chain of being because people at the top have more being than things at the bottom. They have more being. This is a really important notion to get into because we don't think like this anymore. Thank God. Therefore, males have more being than females. Aquinas, for example, defines a woman as an abnormal man. She has less being. They both partake of the same essence. You just have less of it. And therefore, women are more immoral. They're more emotional. They don't quite match up. See, I mean, it's built into the system. It's not an accident of the system. It's part of the system. And you would have below even less being animals, and then plants and minerals until you get to non-being, things that aren't. Well, there aren't any things that aren't. They're just not. Okay. Aristotle is really the great systematizer of this stuff, and I like Aristotle. I probably am more sympathetic to Aristotle than to Plato. This is a very interesting quote from Aristotle. The household in its perfect form consists of slaves and freemen. That's his first notice. When he defines a household, by which he means what we would call a family. Okay? It consists of slaves and freemen. I want you to put this in your mind. This is hierarchy at its root. The investigation of everything should begin with its smallest parts. Aristotle is a reductionist. Okay, reductionism is not an invention of modern science. The ancients did it too. Okay, you get to the smallest parts in order to understand what the big thing is. And the primary and smallest parts of the household are master and slave. Now, if I asked people in this room, what is the primary part of the family, I'm sure most everybody would say husband and wife. Not Aristotle. And neither does anybody in the ancient world. It's master-slave. And then husband and wife are a model of master and slave. Starting to make sense, right? Huh? And then father and children are also a model of master and slave. Notice what it's not. It's not mother and children. because she's never a master. So it's a totally hierarchical model, built upon the model of master and slave. Now, this is fundamental to Western thought. Not accidental, it's fundamental. You will go into church today, probably, and pray to your Lord God. The word for Lord there, kurios in the Greek, Adonai in the Hebrew, Dominus in Latin means master, and you are the slave. It's fundamental. There's a reason why Dom Corleone is called Dom. That's the Latin, Italian word for Dominus, master. See? So it's fundamental to how the whole West has been put together. This is a simple little example from Aristotle on slavery. A slave is one who is a human being belonging by nature not to himself but to another, and is by nature a slave. The very fact that some people are meant by their very nature to be owned by other people. And a person is a human being belonging to another. If being a man, he is an article of property. And an article of property is an instrument for the action separable from its owner. That is, you can use the person. Okay. Notice how reductionist he is, okay? To be a slave for Aristotle is natural. We must next consider whether it is advantageous and just for anyone to be a slave, or whether, on the contrary, all slavery is against nature. Now, notice this is Aristotle in the 5th century. He is entertaining the question whether or not whether slavery is immoral. He's asking a very ethical question, an ethical question that goes to the foundation of his society. He lives in a slave society. Okay? And it is not difficult either to discern the answer by theory or to learn it empirically. And he's very scientific. Authority and insubordination are conditions not only inevitable but also expedient. That is, you look at reality and it is ordered hierarchically. Some people are on top, some people are on the bottom. That's the way it's supposed to be. Ergo, this is a syllogism, okay? Ergo. In some cases, things are marked out from the moment of birth to rule or be ruled. Therefore, slavery is natural. This was the argument in the West until the 17th century. It only got challenged in the 17th century. And there are people saying today that if we look at the natural state of things, it really is authoritarian. This is an argument being seriously made. Okay, so Aristotle is still alive, folks. Don't count him out. The 10 Commandments are a great example of traditional deontology system. Okay, there they are. They're given by God. What's your duty? Follow them. To obey them. Okay, and notice that the covenant is transactional. God says, if you do these things, I will do these things for you. It's a bargain. That's why it's called a covenant. Okay? You can fancy it up with theological terms. I'm really good at that, by the way. But it's still a bargain. Okay? You do this, follow your duty, I'll give you this. Okay? That's why we always say, well, why did God let this happen? Because the bargain's been broken, right? We know how that logic works, even if we don't admit it. Okay. Welcome to the Revolution. This is a famous song by Hi-Rez and Julies. This is Voltaire. And Voltaire is really the beginning of the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment changes Aristotle and everything else. And Voltaire and the Enlightenment folks start the revolution that we've hit in the 60s. Where did the 60s begin? With Voltaire. Okay, he's what started it. It just took a while to really get speed. Okay, it actually got speed almost immediately. What's important to notice about this is Voltaire's salon. And if you look here, this is Voltaire, and this is in a salon by Mademoiselle L'Enfant Pissot. It's a woman. She is running a salon. Would never happen in the age of Aristotle. Okay, and notice carefully here, look at the women. They're all over in this picture. It's not just all men. It's pretty mixed. And that was characteristic of Enlightenment conversations, that they're mixed. Okay? It's really kind of important. Once you start challenging things, one of the first group to come up out of slavery are women. And right behind them come slaves, or they'll come together. So, Plato actually begins to sense that there's a problem with deontology. And he raises this in the Euthyphro in a famous quote: "The holy has been acknowledged to us to be loved of God because it is holy. It is not holy because it is loved by God." And he applies this legally. He says the law is not good because it's given by God. Okay? But it has to be good in itself. And when you really think about that, it begins to undercut the whole system. Because then on what authority? That means God comes about finding out what the law is in exactly the same way we do. So the ancients already understood they had a problem. They just didn't know what to do about it. The emperor preferred to forget it. Okay. The Enlightenment, we Americans forget, of course, that our Declaration of Independence and our Constitution are fundamentally Enlightenment documents. And they come right out of the Enlightenment. They are Enlightenment documents. Notice Jefferson's statement here. "We hold these truths to be self-evident. That is, they require no proof. All you have to do is look." Now, why people hadn't seen this for several millennia is a bit of a problem, but that all men are created equal. Now, does he mean anthropos? Males only? Does he mean slaves? It's interesting when you look at the life of Jefferson. When he wrote this phrase, he meant it as including both men, women, and slaves. As he grew older, he changed his mind. It's kind of interesting. They are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This comes right out of David Hume, of course, one of the great Enlightenment thinkers. So it's almost a cribbing out of Hume. Okay? So now look what happens. Instead of being a hierarchical model, it's the individual that is the model. See? It comes out of everyone is created equal. There's nobody above. There is nobody below. It's equal. So it comes out of the individual. Rights adhere in the individual, not in a hierarchy. And that's a revolutionary notion. And it sparks quickly two revolutions, the French Revolution and the American Revolution, one of which was more successful than the other, ours, which came first. So we are the first revolution in history. And we are the first real democracy in history. A lot's at stake. The American Constitution begins. I'm a kind of a nut on constitutional history. I have nutty things I get interested in. Constitutional history is one. Emily Dickinson has been one my entire life. If I've ever had a love affair, she's it. We the people, when the convention originally drafted this, it said we, and then put all the states, all 13 of them. And when Grosvenor rewrote it, Morris Grover is actually the person who rewrote the Constitution, redrafted it. He put "we the people," and they voted on it and accepted it. That fundamentally changes it. I mean, it's no longer a series of states, it's the whole people. See? We the people of the United States. So this Constitution does not come from any hierarchical authority, does not come from God, does not come from a king, because they're trying to overthrow the king. They've already done it. It comes from the people, so that all power comes from the people, not from on high. There is no mention of God in the Constitution. Just not there. It's a real problem for the current Supreme Court. In order to establish a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, and provide for the common defense. Notice, common defense. This is Thomas Aquinas. Okay? And promote the general welfare and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. No appeal to higher authority. It's a completely Enlightenment document. Now look at Romans 13. This tells you what a deontological system looks like. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities. By the way, I don't think this is written by Paul. I think this was added to Romans later in the early 2nd century. But that's a whole different argument. I promise not to get into the New Testament, okay? For there is no authority except from God. See, now this statement is very typical of Greco-Roman theory, legal theory. It's just right out of it. That's the way they understand the world. It's hierarchical up and down. Okay? The Constitution is not. It's we the people. The two are not compatible. We've been trying for a long time, but they're really not compatible. Rights are by their very nature expansive. Madison notices this early on. He's one of the first persons to really write about this. It's why he was initially opposed to the 10, I just went blank. What the heck are the 10? No, amendments. The first Bill of Rights, thank you. Man, getting old is crap. Thank you, Cindy. The Bill of Rights, Madison was originally opposed to him because he said all those rights are implied in the Constitution. See? Because he understood rights as expansive. You don't know what a right means when you first find it. It has to explore and find itself. So it's ongoing. Secondly, rights are corrosive. Rights corrode privilege. It's built into the system. If women get rights, men lose power. I'm sorry, it's just the way it is. And then if women get rights, maybe children should have rights. Oh my God, I mean, they don't even have any being with Aristotle. And now we're talking about animal rights. See? Which, by the way, if you look into it, it's very hard to argue against. So rights are expansive and they corrode the system that they're replacing. It's a corrosive effect. We had, right after the Enlightenment, 3 kinds of revolutions started immediately. The first one was the individual, the discovering of what individual rights were. And people started asking for, imagine this, the vote. You know? And then immediately women. You know? Elizabeth Woodstone writes her book on feminist rights 2 years after Voltaire's original book. Really quick. And she gets almost everything you're still asking for. And slavery comes with it. We get the first slavery votes. You know? And the French Constitution moves quickly to abolish slavery. Okay? So they're all tied together, and it corrodes. Once you say we're all created equal, you then can't take it back. It just keeps getting bigger and bigger and eating away at the system. So we had a French Revolution, American Revolution, a French Revolution, the American Declaration in 1776, Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen in 1789. So this stuff got off the ground quick, and it really turned the world upside down. Traditional rights are from above. Individual rights come from below. They come from the people. Okay? You have your rights innately. They are not given to you. It's innate. It's in your being as a human person. See, they're not even God-given in a strict sense. In traditional, your duty is to obey. In an enlightenment system, it's to question and to vote. You may question your leaders. That is part of what citizenship is about. So that's a fundamentally different way of talking about how you make ethical decisions. In a traditional, the law is eternal. Rights are corrosive. Laws are shifting and changing and expanding. And you have to discover what they mean. To all of this, what happened in the 1960s, we had a massive conservative backlash. I'm not talking politically, I'm talking historically. This happened. It's probably still underway in many ways. Despite a huge conservative backlash, not just in the United States, but in many, many places as well, the trends did not change. Reagan and Margaret Thatcher had no influence on the fundamental trends that were going on in society. Women kept pushing for their rights, blacks kept pushing for their rights, marriage went down, cohabitation went up, family values went in the toilet. They just became a campaign promise. So this conservative backlash had no effect on the tradition of the way these things were moving. They're still moving in that direction. It's a kind of fundamental problem. Okay? So how do you make ethical decisions? We live, people of our generation, and I'm probably most likely the oldest person in the room, or close to it, but we've all lived through this same thing. Most of us in this room, without thinking about it, live in two systems. We live in a traditional system and we live in a rights system. It just depends on what hat we got on. And they don't fit. So naturally, we experience an awful lot of cognitive dissonance. You know, well, how did this happen? What's this mean? You know, that's the state of being a human today. Because we have this whole long tradition, very powerful tradition, that's not going to go away. You know, I used to tell my female students when they get all upset, well, change isn't happening fast enough. My point was something that's been around since we cavemen is not going to disappear real quick. It's going to be a battle. Okay? So we're really kind of caught. Most of us were raised in traditional families with traditional values and then had to confront change. That's a very painful experience. And we don't know which way to go. And so we make convoluted ethical decisions. I'll speak personally. I moved to this side very early. It was the Vietnam War did it for me. I just, jumping out of a helicopter for 18 months really changed my mind about a lot of things. Okay, and that one went. Now, I was fortunate to have a kind of classical education, so I knew what I was giving up. And I've worked with that same education most of my life, so I live in that kind of world. But ethically, I made the jump very, very early. The question has always been for me, what am I holding on to? What's the non-negotiable? And for example, in my life, the big non-negotiable was the family. So that has all kind of been in the traditional. If you look at me as a family person, I'm going to look pretty traditional. If you look at me politically, I'm on the far left. The two don't quite fit. See, from my mind they do, but that's because everybody else is dumb. See, I have a hard time selling that argument. So most of us are in some form, one way or the other. Now notice what's happened in terms of American politics here. Liberals are the people primarily pushing this side. Conservatives are the people pushing this side. But no liberal and no conservative is pure in this matter. Well, there are some out there that are just nuts. But most people are, on various issues, moving back and forth on here. Conservatives, as Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher demonstrate, have not slowed this ethical movement. They bought into it. All they did was put the brakes on a little. So the conservative argument has primarily been in the modern period, let's don't change too fast. The conservative argument has not really been, let's don't change. That would be the really conservative argument. We call that reactionary. The real conservative argument out of somebody like Margaret Thatcher or Ronald Reagan is they made plenty of changes. Okay, Margaret Thatcher, as a prime minister, was not exactly a conservative move. She's a woman. See? So she wanted some change, but just not all of it. So that's been the conservative point. Liberals have been the ones who have pushed. And they kind of rely on conservatives to keep them going too far. And there's been this kind of dynamic, which it seems to me is now breaking down. We don't have the dynamic right now. It's really kind of falling apart, has fallen apart. So we're back to ethical decisions. How do you make them? Very convoluted. We don't have a pure system. See? You're really caught more and more, and your children and grandchildren even more so, on making decisions based upon your own experience. The problem with that is, should ethics be fundamentally individual, or is Aquinas right that the common good is the primary aspect? When you're in a family, you have to make it for the common good of the family. But we no longer think of the country as a family. We think of it as a group of individuals. We've lost the family metaphor. So ethical decisions on a private line are still problematic, but not as hard. The further up the scale you move, the more difficult they get. The more you have to deal with large groups of people, we are running out of how do we make the decision? Where do we go? Because we don't have that kind of common agreement. Okay? We want rights, we want to move forward, but we're stuck.
Define ethical for us, please.
Yeah, ethical. The philosophers make a primary distinction between morality and ethics. Both are concerned with what's right or wrong. Morality is what you do kind of without thinking. Most of us are moral people without thinking about it too much. We have a sense of what's right and wrong. I always used to say it's your mother's voice. You know, it's the way you were arranged and trained. Ethics is when you think about it, when you have to reason to an argument. So for example, take a classical example, thou shalt not kill. Okay, that's morality. But when you have to think about when you're going to do it, that becomes ethics. There's nothing absolute about that law. Okay? There's plenty of killing in the Hebrew Bible. Okay? But that requires ethics. Then you have to start to think, and then did I do the right thing or not? So that's really the fundamental difference. Ethics is when you have to think about a decision. Yes?
What happens to responsibility? With rights come responsibility, and you're going from both sides,
Yeah.
but nobody talks about that.
Well, rights theory doesn't talk a lot about responsibility because it's hard to talk about. Responsibility involves the common good. And we don't have a theory of the common good in rights thinking. That's kind of been part of the problem in forcing this through. How do you do it?
It should start at the beginning. If I'm going to give you this right, this is your responsibility.
No, you're thinking like the lawgiver. Notice what you just said. If I give you this right. No. They have the right. That's the fundamental problem. You have to really think about this consistently. Giving rights is the traditional model. In the modern model, after the Enlightenment, the right is innate. We hold these truths to be self-evident. They're innate. They're in you. You have these rights as a human being. So part of the problem in the modern period has been, what's a human being? See? Because a human being, ethically, is this emerging body of rights. See? Aristotle doesn't have any problem. A human being is below an angel and above a slave. That's an easy one. See, ours is much more complex because we're not really quite sure theoretically what a human being is.
They were also below a demon.
Oh yeah, you got all these, you can make the thing really complicated, and it gets complicated, yeah. And that's where you have to watch your language. I'm not trying to pick on you. I'm just trying. We slip into this stuff really easy. If you give them right, no, you don't give rights. You have a right. See.
Well, I have a problem with people who are human beings or societies. If they don't accept responsibility, I don't feel like they're entitled to the rights.
Well, entitlements, that's you're still given things.
But someone's got to be responsible.
Well, no. Nobody has to be responsible. If everyone lives up to their right, responsibility disappears.
Yes, but you're assuming that everyone lives up to their responsibility.
No, everybody lives up to their rights. If you act according, this is the old question Augustine asked. You can't ask me questions; they all turn into history. I'm sorry, it's just the way I think. Augustine raises exactly this question. He says, "Love and do whatever you want." Well, if you don't think like Augustine does, that means you can do whatever you want to. Augustine would say, if you love, you will know what to do. So in the same thing as in rights theory, if you fundamentally understand your rights, what it means, you will know what that means. It's not divided into rights and responsibilities. It's a right that is a way in which you are.
How do rights and law coexist?
Very uneasily. Very uneasily. But we have some lawyers in the room. I assume every church is usually cursed with some. Law, technically, is the way you spell out what rights are. It's the way you spell out. So, for example, the Constitution does not contain any laws. The laws come afterwards. They have to spell out what all that means. See? And we're still doing it. It's a kind of an unending process. And it's a convoluted process because lawyers, by their very nature, want to make sure whatever they say can only be understood in one way. And language doesn't work that way, so then they can sue somebody. So it's really John Rawls is kind of the primary theorist in the English language on laws and rights, and it's a thorny problem, but yeah. Because rights exist at a different level cognitively, epistemally, than laws do. Laws exist at a concrete level. Rights are emerging. They, from a philosophical level, they almost exist at the level of being. You know, they're almost an abstraction. They really are a kind of abstraction, except we think they're real. So that makes the decision making more difficult. So, am I run out of time? No. I worry about going too far. So, I mean, fundamentally, my point here is we're in a very difficult situation. You know, I don't have, and I don't know anybody else who does, has a magic wand who makes all this go away. The Enlightenment started this. It shows no sign of ending. You know, it's an ongoing effect. And personally, I view the Supreme Court decision on Dobbs as an effort to do away with the Enlightenment. If you read the Dobbs decision, God, I wouldn't wish that. I have read it, by the way. What it in effect does is make women slaves. It says you no longer have a right over your body. The state has the right over your body. Now, that's fundamentally anti-constitutional. That's against the Enlightenment. See? So you can argue this one out any way you want to, but we're in this. This is a very tough societal debate, and it's going on at all kinds of levels. It goes on with the individual. It goes on in our families. How do you raise your children? Do you raise them with strict family father, or do you raise them with nurturing parent? How do you live in the society? I mean, it affects all of this.
I may have missed this, but you define right. I mean, what's a right?
Well, as Aristotle says, you want to go to the most simple thing. The rights are things you innately have that separate you from everybody else. The problem with first principles is they're very hard to define.
The discomfort of religion.
Yes, religion is really, traditional religion, of course, is in this one. That's no swing. And Protestantism, Catholicism has clearly, I was raised Roman Catholic, have for a long time considered myself Catholic, becoming extremely uncomfortable with that lately. I think I'm the only Catholic left. Protestantism has made much more of an effort. Catholicism has decided it's going to stay in the Enlightenment. It's going to stay against the Enlightenment. It has fundamentally, I think, every chance it has had to come to terms with the highly patriarchal structure of the Roman Church, it's neglected to do it. It's taken the opposite path. So I think that's over. Personally, I don't think it's going to do it. Protestantism is on the cuff. You've got one whole movement of Protestantism that's very much committed to deontological position, and you have people like yourselves who are trying to figure out, can you go with the Enlightenment or not? And most of the time you probably do, but try to hide it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have some announcements to make. It's been a tough week for me, and it wasn't the game yesterday. I introduced our guests as Abrams. I have a customer, a really good customer named Sam Abrams, and that's always in my mind when I see you. It's Schwartz, Bob and Brooke Schwartz. I'm sorry. Don't forget about the blankets. And I have to tell you a joke when talking about the 60s, when I graduated from college, somebody, as I was going into work for this very large company, said, in order to be recognized, women have to work twice as hard as men. And then they said, but that's not too hard.